Well, Richard, thanks so much for joining me today on the Mark Divine Show. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So you're at the Mayo Clinic, and thank you for clarifying the pronunciation before we started. And you've been there for a number of years, but um, and you're running leadership programs there. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But before we kind of dig into your view on leadership and leadership development, can you give us a sense for kind of what got you on the path um, that led to your, the formative career? Like, what were your early influences? What was it that kind of got you interested in medicine and then leadership? What did all that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I was born, and at that point, I knew I was going to be running leadership development programs at Mayo Clinic, right?
You were born at a very young age. Hi,
Yeah,
so was I. That's awesome.
right. It's it all happens just like life does by chance, and so honestly, I was a really poor high school student, C minus sort of average, and
Right.
did not do well in biology. And
Uh-oh.
then got my act together in college, and then decided I wanted to be a physician,
Right.
and then went to Mayo Medical School and had a great time there and learned a lot. Then went to emergency medicine residency, and after
Hmm.
that started practicing. And so as I'm starting practicing and taking care of patients one by one, you start to see that there's some things that might be done better, or that you have ideas for how things could be better. And to do that, then you kind of step into these leadership roles. And so as you step into leadership roles, how do you do that? Like, how do you even like I can, as I'm seeing patients, I can write an order, but as
Right.
I'm in meetings with people, it doesn't seem like the orders I'm writing are coming across as I wanted to. And so somewhere in there, I ended up becoming chair of the department. Ended up becoming president of medical staff, and went and got an MBA.
Hmm.
And as MBA, learned this whole new language, because I realized that the doctors were speaking a different language from the administrators. And in there, there was a course on coaching. And I
Hmm.
always thought about coaching as being like, I don't know, talking about feelings and things like that. And I didn't really have a great understanding of it. But what I found was in the coaching training was a way of thinking about how I could be effective, how I was thinking. And then really helpful was to be able to sit with others and to be able to help them figure out how they can be most effective.
Hmm.
And so, really, from that point then on, leadership opportunities, raised. And then I was also coaching more healthcare leaders around the United States, and
Hmm.
then somehow got to Mayo and ended up getting to this point where we're talking right now.
That's fascinating. We have a coaching program in my company, and we consider it to be a master skill for leaders. And I think you kind of stumbled upon that, right? Um, and I understand the University of Texas, where you went and got your MBA, they have an exceptional coaching program. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you learned there? Because I think that's a good place for us to start kind of talking about leadership and leadership development, because coaching is so important.
Yeah, and so one of the things for me, as because I was practicing at the time, I wasn't a college student, so this was mid career
Right.
and looking for ways of applying exactly what I was learning. The University of Texas at Dallas has, I believe, the oldest graduate training in executive coaching,
Is that right?
and so it was great. So I was for the MBA program, it was exclusively physicians, but then when I
Mhm.
went into the coaching program after that, it was people from all sorts of industries, and it was one of these settings where I'd go and I'd train, probably 6 hours a week after shifts and things like that, and it was
Mhm.
all done online. And so occasionally meeting people in person, but it from a coaching perspective, it was a nice way to you just get you start coaching each other, start coaching colleagues, you start learning what works, you start um, coaching and then hearing from others, that's not really the right approach, and adjusting your approach. So it was a
Mhm.
very very helpful situation.
What was there a particular model that they taught for coaching? I mean, a framework. I mean, can you describe kind of what a framework would look like for someone if they're like, okay, I'm a leader and I need to learn how to coach. So do you just go get a coach, or do you become a coach?
Totally. Yeah, so I think and models, as you become a coach, there's lots of models that you're floating in and out of. I think the easy model for most people to understand is the grow model. It's kind
Hmm.
of the stereotypical coaching thing, and the idea
Right.
is that as you're talking to someone, the G is goals. So you want to
Hmm.
understand what their goal is. What are you trying to
Right.
get to? And then and then R is basically the reality of what they're experiencing. So what's going on right now? Discuss
Right.
how you're experiencing things. What are the things that you're doing that are working and not working? And then O is options. So now, given all that, how might you move forward? What are some things you might do?
Right.
And then way is actually the way forward that you're going to choose into action.
Right.
So as you think about a coaching engagement, you're trying to understand first of all the goal. You don't want to jump to way forward before you really understand what's going on in their sense of like their
Right.
reality. And so it offers this really nice kind of successive way of going through just thinking.
Right. I love that. It gives you a model to think about your thinking. I actually went through training in the Grow model many, many years ago, and it was designed by a famous tennis coach. I don't know if he was the author of Inside Tennis or I forget his name now, but that's where that came from. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, yeah, it's been around for a while. It's
Yeah.
good. And I think on top of that, then the nice thing about that program is Robert Hicks was the individual who found it. He had this idea that you're either supporting like action or thinking, or you're
Right.
actually challenging action or thinking. And so it's nice to think about that as you're talking to someone. Am I supporting what they're thinking, or maybe I'm challenging them and challenging them in a way that's actually helping them to think about things in a broader perspective. And then the same thing as they move towards action, how can you support it and how can you challenge it? So you can start to see these frameworks kind of coming together as you're thinking about options. You might support and you might challenge the
Yeah.
options. You might support and challenge their sense of what's going on in their
I
situation.
like that. I've always looked at the coach's role as really kind of holding a mirror up to the client to help them kind of see the truth maybe a little bit more clearly,
Yep.
devoid of their biases or fears or, whatever's holding them back from understanding, but also to provide some perspective or help them find that perspective. So that's really cool. So then you brought these skills back as a leader into Mayo.
Yeah.
And then at what point or how did it evolve to where you were basically doing this as a full-time thing within the Mayo, family of businesses?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's not full time. So as a
No.
physician, I'm still practicing. I'm still
Oh,
in the
you
emergency
are?
department taking care of
Okay.
patients. Yeah.
Right on.
And
I didn't
so
know that.
that's actually one of the special things about Mayo is for the majority of the leadership there, even at very high levels, they're still practicing. So they have kind of their skin in the game.
Right.
Um, yeah. So as I was prior to coming to Mayo, I was already coaching individuals in healthcare organizations, and it was one of these like, how do I get back to Mayo? Because I had gone to medical school here, and I had a
Mhm.
conversation with one of my old MBA coaches, and he said, "Hey, do you know the chief HR officer over at Mayo?" And I said, "No," and he said, "Let me introduce you to her." And so that's what got me back into the door at Mayo. When I came here, then, so I'm seeing patients, and it's one of these situations I think probably many people find themselves in is I am a fish in a big pond.
Yeah.
Or at Mayo, we like to think of like I'm a one star in a constellation of stars.
Mhm.
And so as I got here, it's seeing patients on the one hand, but then on the other hand, taking on some coaching engagements, speaking a little bit more, having people get to know you, and then all of a sudden being able to develop programs and then writing books and doing things like that. So it was a
Mhm.
very successive sort of step by step thing.
Within Mayo, as an organization, is coaching mandatory, or is it like, hey, someone comes to you and says, "I heard about your work. I could use a little help."
Yeah. So I think as we think about coaching, a lot of times people think about coaching from a corrective perspective. Someone's doing
Right.
something wrong. Oh no, you need you need to go see a
Right.
coach.
Right. Yeah, it's
And that is
mandated.
one form of coaching, but that's
Right.
not the form of coaching that I think of in terms of the way most things are, and especially at Mayo. And so all the senior leaders are offered coaches,
Got
and
it.
and so they have coaching. And then there are anyone who's a department chair or a leader administratively is also offered coaches. And then for people who are below, like people who are not leading lots of people, who do not have a lot
Mhm.
of direct reports, and so an individual surgeon who may not be a leader, they have an opportunity to have professional coaching. So different from
Mhm.
executive coaching, professional coaching.
Mhm.
And yeah, and we have some funds that are set aside that you can put towards education or coaching or
I
or,
see.
or reading stuff, and people will use that for that.
That's interesting. Let me just kind of clarify. So, executive coaching is for an executive, and a professional coach is for a non-executive professional. But the models or the actual process is not going to be really different, right? It's just the size of the problems, maybe.
Yeah, very much. And obviously they blur because executives have professional problems or
Right, right,
challenges they want to solve, and vice versa. I think of executive myself as being those who really have a significant number of direct reports and
right.
are oftentimes dealing with boards or at that senior level.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to talk about your book. You're the leader. Now what? Great title. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have actually felt that, like, okay, now what? I've just been just handed this massive responsibility. And of course, there's so much about leadership that is taken for granted that is really nuanced, right? Obviously, context, situation, perspectives, dealing with the different levels of development of all your team, and who largely lack awareness of those different stage or levels of development. So development in psychology comes in, social psychology, organizational structure, organizational psych. There's so much involved in this field of leadership. So what kind of personal frame of reference do you have beyond the coaching frame of reference, which we're talking about, and I want to talk about more? But what's your leadership frame or style, or what's the didactic around what you consider to be leadership?
Yeah, I think the key thing, as particular in healthcare, and I think really as I've coached individuals outside the industry, is that we all get into leadership positions because we're really good at what we do, and people are looking to us to kind of step forward. As we're doing the things that we do, we're experts, and people come to us and they seek answers, and we give answers, and we move on from there. But once we become leaders, then it's no longer about like, what do you think? You make the decision. It's often more towards like now you're facilitating, which I actually think about is like coaching. And
Right.
so we're facilitating groups of individuals. How do we all come together, all of us with different perspectives, to make decisions as quickly as possible in a way that allows us to see through each other's blind spots and what's going
Right.
on outside? Or we're coaching as leaders, and whether if I'm meeting one to one with a colleague and trying to help them kind of make sense of the world, or even myself as a leader trying to make sense of what's going on there. So I really I think the coaching framework, that facilitative framework, it's not like an elective of leadership now. This is the requirement for leadership.
Yeah.
And so the writing the book is like, you're the leader now what, is oftentimes what happens is as I'm coaching someone, they get themselves into a situation or they find themselves in the midst of a challenge where like their friends, their colleagues are disagreeing. There's a lot of tensions, emotions are running high, and then they're looking to the leader to figure out like what to do. And the
Right.
leader's like, "Geez, how do I take care of this?" And so the intent, actually, as I was writing the book, was I would like there's some basic things about just how to approach these really challenging situations that if the leaders could know this, then I could really start to coach them about how they're making sense of the world as opposed to how to approach making sense of the world.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I like that. The amongst the leadership theories, one of the most kind of like, I guess, relevant and what people would self-identify with is transformational leadership.
Yeah.
And I think the coaching model, the idea of coaching and mentoring and evolving, transforming the individuals that you're in relationship with is really almost a subset of that. But it goes beyond that, right? Because you have to focus on also the organizational systems, that often might block or hinder or not be, optimized, right? In fact,
Yep.
it brings me kind of like one of the big principles. The first principle in your book is to question best practice, right? Because what's best practice for one period of time might not be for the next. Like, for instance, in this post-pandemic world, or what we hope is post-pandemic world, like there's a lot of new best practices that need to be evolved, right? And so if the leaders are waiting to go back to the old normal, then they're asking the wrong questions, right?
Exactly.
So what's your perspective on and how do you coach people to question best practices and be open to something new emerging?
Yeah, and so there was a quote. It was, I believe, David Snowden, who wrote a great HBR article. He does a lot of stuff, but the quote that I remember from him is that best practices are, by definition, past practices. And
Right.
it just like crystallizes things, because
It
so there
does.
are things, and I can think about in medicine. There was a time when we used to use leeches and we used to do bloodletting, and that was best practice at the time. And I can just imagine the meetings with people like, oh, are you saying we don't let the blood to help people get better? That's
Right.
ridiculous. Or really, wash hands, and those sorts of
Right.
things are best practices that no, it doesn't fit so much. And so we're in this really evolving world where things are really complex, and they're the things we don't know. And so how do we make sure that what we're doing today even still fits?
Right.
And so you oftentimes will have people in meetings where, and especially like using Mayo Clinic as an example, we have a lot of tradition. And that's part of what's really strengthens the organization is our mission and our values and this tradition of where we come from. And within that, there can be a danger of individuals holding on to tradition. But on the other hand, to succeed, you have to innovate and you have to break
Right.
apart things and see things in new ways and perhaps approach patients in different ways.
Right.
And so you often get this tension of the innovators in the room and the traditions in the room, traditionalists in the room, figuring out how to make things work. And it's really okay. Does this best practice still hold? And so let's go through this process of trying to figure that out.
Yeah. Do you have a specific um, methodology or like trick to help people break free of some of those conditioned best practice patterns and to think about something new or to begin to
Yeah.
consider new things?
Yeah, I love how we started out talking about frameworks because, and I'm going to go back to David Snowden. He wrote an HBR article, I believe, is in 2008, about the Cynefin framework, and it's spelled
Hmm.
Cynefin.
Mm.
And he's still very active. And what he talks about is just what kind of problem are we facing? Like what kind
Right.
of problem is this? And so it's important for us as a group to understand just kind of what kind of problem is. And so there are things that are clear that like I know it's clear to me that the way I should sit down in this chair is bottom first. And for everyone in the room, they would agree with that, right? A patient with a trauma comes in and their blood pressure is low and they've been bleeding. There are things like we just all know in the room what to do. It's common sense. It's clear.
Right.
Those are things that don't require a lot of discussion. But that's the area of best practices. And then there are things that are complicated. And so, as an emergency physician, as a patient comes in and they're having a heart attack, I'll call a cardiologist because they,
Hmm.
they have expertise. And now this next step of what to do with it, I'm not going to call an orthopedic surgeon. And so, this in this place of complication, we require experts, and we just ask experts what to do, and the experts kind of assess the situation, the data that's out there. They may not always agree, but they're making decisions about data that's known and possibilities of what's going to occur that are known.
Right.
This is the easy side.
That's
What
right.
tends to happen though in leadership is we're on this other side, which is things that we don't know, things that are complex or chaos. And so, in this place of complexity, we're sitting in the room, and so COVID comes along. There's a lot of things we don't know, and actually, we don't even know what we don't know, and we don't know
Right.
like if we were all sitting in the room, like what's going to happen. Like five of us, we wouldn't even agree upon the possible outcomes.
Right.
And then there's chaos, which is complexity on top of like squeezed time. Like we have to make decisions right now, in which case you can't get a bunch of people together. You just have to have a leader who's going to step up and make decisions.
Right.
The thing about best practices, we can be holding on to best practices, like, for example, pre COVID best practices, which now 6 months into the pandemic, they no longer hold. And now we're in this place of chaos because we've been complacent. And so
Right.
it's how do we all know kind of which phase we're in, and then how do we apply the best approach to that?
Right. And dealing with complexity is like you said, it's orders of magnitude harder than dealing with complication or the simple challenges. I mean, this is something that I come from the Navy SEAL background. I was a SEAL commander,
Yeah,
and we train for VUCA, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity,
right.
ambiguity. So we get very good, and we also there are certain like strategy and tactics, but it's mostly mindset,
Mhm.
right? And it's the mindset of getting radically accepting of everything changing all the time.
Yep.
And so that any type of SOP or standard operating procedure, which you would call a best practice that you develop in by definition has to be flexible and also evolving. And so that takes a certain type of mindset to be able to navigate or get comfortable. It's very uncomfortable for experts and for people who've been trained in the more linear kind of models of thinking to think this way. So, how do you help clients begin to develop a mindset where they can deal with VUCA as a standard, right, as a matter of course, or as a new normal?
Yeah, and I love the point you're making. It is a very adaptive approach. as you're
Right.
talking about the Navy SEAL approach, very adaptive. And our
Right.
best leaders are very adaptive because there are times when, let's say, there are leaders who feel very comfortable about reaching out to colleagues, getting a bunch of people together and collaborating and moving forward. But that doesn't work in times of chaos. That doesn't
Right.
work when you have this time pressure and you need to make a decision. And then there are other leaders who feel very comfortable in that space of kind of chaos where, okay, I don't have all the data, but I'm gonna make a decision. I'm gonna kind of project out in my mind what might occur, and I'm gonna kind of role play, and then I'm gonna make the decision and decide.
Hmm.
These may be two different kinds of leaders.
Right.
Our best leaders are able to do both, because what the worst, you have a leader who's then like, command and control, and this is what we're going to do, but then all of a sudden that chaos goes away and they're still commanding and controlling. That just doesn't work. On
Right.
the other hand, if someone's trying to like get everyone together when you just need to make a decision,
Right.
that's not going to work. And so helping leaders identify that, what kind of situation are you in? Do you really need to reach out right now, or do you just need to decide based on mission values and what you think is the right way of going? Understanding that you don't have all the information that you need, and understanding that as you're making a decision now, the goal isn't necessarily to get things right. Your goal is to poke kind of the reality, the situation, and see how it responds to your solution, and then to
Right.
adapt and continue on
Right.
versus getting a bunch of people together.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great distinction, and I agree with that. One of the biggest challenges also for complexity and chaos is fear, and fear can immobilize, as you know, right? The fear response will lock people into fight or flight or freeze, and especially freeze in the corporate sense. And I notice in your book you talk about that, as one of the kind of the foundations to being a good leader is to overcome or explore the fear and the things that are really keeping you stuck. So how do you like what's the dialogue like? How do you get people to really overcome their fear, or what I call a
Yeah.
false expectation appearing real, or a false evidence appearing real?
Yeah, I mean, fear, like, festers in silence. It's like it's a monster that'll just, you can
Right.
sit in a meeting and, oh, what a great decision, then move out. And if you haven't acknowledged the fears and the worries that individuals have, your strategy is basically destroyed before you leave the room.
Right.
And you can understand in a meeting where you have individuals together that some people may not feel like they can speak up. There may be powerful individuals in the room. Maybe they're not the sort of individual that can just in the moment make that decision. And so we need to, as leaders, unroof, like, what are the fears? Deliberately call out, what are your fears about moving forward?
Hmm.
And it's funny because sometimes as I go in and I'm doing, consulting with organizations, one of the things a leader will say is, whatever you do, don't mention like FTEs, or don't, whatever you do, don't mention, this sort of thing. And I'm thinking that's exactly what we're going to mention, because this
Right.
thing of which you not speak, this Voldemort of a situation is
Right.
why things are not working.
I love it.
And so
Exactly.
you really you need to call out the fears and worries, because those fears and worries are not just someone who doesn't want change. It's someone who is seeing perhaps parts of the problem that you are not seeing, and like real impediments to moving forward. And so if you know the fears and worries, then as you're visioning like how you're going to move forward, you can then take those into consideration. You can try to decrease the chance of those fears happening. And as you're
Right.
decreasing the chance of those fears happening, that's going to change the options that you might choose to move forward, and
Right.
the ways that you can be successful.
That's interesting. So that's like bringing it to into awareness, then you can objectify it and make it something that you can actually solve or work with. But if it's hidden from awareness, then it's just going to be an obstacle, right? It's just going to be an obstacle. When For me, like when I'm working with leaders and clients, I find that their underlying story, their personal story, um, and the mask that they put on, their own biases, or what the psychology profession would call shadow, tend to be the biggest limiting issues in their
Mhm.
capacity to lead. And so therefore they're projecting, they feel like they've got to be perfect, and they're hiding behind that perfectionism, or they're without understanding why or what's happening, they're being exclusive. They're not being an inclusive leader because their hidden bias is saying, well, that person is not a producer, and so I'm going to ignore them. Or that person, right, has got that quality. And a lot of times they're projecting, but the bottom line is they're not creating an inclusive environment, and so that shuts people down, shuts the team down.
Right.
That was the whole foundation for a book that I wrote called Staring Down the Wolf. And the idea was you got to stare down your own fear and biases and shadow in order to allow the team to really flourish.
Well said.
So how do you get into that underlying story with your clients? I mean, as a coach, as a leader, how do you help them stare down their fear wolves and,
Yeah,
and,
that's great.
and be more authentic, or what Brene Brown would call vulnerable? Although I don't love that term personally, but
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and a lot of this comes from goal setting. And so oftentimes as I'm meeting with a leader, there is an issue that they've been working on that they cannot get through. Atomic Habits is a great book, but
yeah,
sometimes these atomic habits, like they blow up because there
yeah,
are fears and worries underneath them that are not, preventing things
right,
from working out. And so examples of things that leaders bring are example maybe that you were just alluding to, which is when I'm in a meeting, basically I speak up and I tend to take control of the room. It tends to silence people.
right.
And what I'd like to be able to do is kind of just sit back and let the process work out. That's an example. Or when
Excellent.
I'm in a meeting with people I don't know, I keep quiet. And I'd like to be able to better express my ideas and my sense of what's going on and feel safe to do so. Or
Right,
I'm not good at delegating, or all these sorts of things. These are great goals. And I tend to find one of those goals that's really important to them that they've had a hard time working on. And then I start to figure out, so what's going on? And so what are the things that you're doing that work against you, letting the room kind of speak and not speaking over them? What are the things that you're doing? And so the person says, well, you know what, I interrupt them, or I control the agenda, or I keep reinforcing what I was thinking, or all these things that they're doing, the actual things that okay, so now just stop that. But is that going to work? No, because they've tried to stop it and it doesn't work. And so it speaks to, as you were talking about, facing the wolf, which is there are fears and worries that they hold about stopping it. Well,
right,
if I stop controlling the agenda, then maybe they're going to come up with a solution that I don't think is good. Or maybe I'm no longer a leader. Or maybe I won't be the person that they will go to. Or maybe the way a leader is successful is by overriding people. And so this you have this tension then of foot on the gas pedal and foot on the brakes. Whereas yes, they would like to speak up less and allow the room to talk. But on the other hand, if they do that, the fear of not being seen as a leader, not being, getting their point across, and not being able to move towards successful action, it gets intertwined.
right.
And this is an example, as we're again from a framework perspective. This comes from Bob Keegan out
Hmm.
of Harvard, Immunity to
Right,
Change framework, which has been
right.
very, very, I think, helpful. Great book
Yeah,
and Lisa Leahy is a co-investigator and
yeah,
co-author on
yeah.
that.
We use that, by the way, in our coaching. It's phenomenal.
It's
Yeah. So let's kind of build on this, because the immunity to change and overcoming these things, then, like I said, it can shut people down. And one of the, obviously, let me back up a little bit. DEI is obviously a big issue these days, right? And so boards are now they're like, okay, DEI is important. It's on our radar. So we're going to do these things. And usually that ends up not really leading anywhere, because it's DEI, or inclusion and diversity, is more than just a set of rules, right?
yeah, right.
It really comes down to what we're talking about: the individual leader's ability to include and to overcome their own biases and whatnot. And that immunity to change is really prevalent, and so people don't they're resistant to that change. But I think that from what I've learned, and as a leader, that there's so much value in inclusiveness and diversity. And not only is it being demanded at a board level, but it's being craved at the individual team level, right? And we're seeing this big problem with disengagement and quiet quitting, and
Mhm.
people literally just leaving the workforce in droves, and it's because they don't feel included.
Yep.
And we can even use the term engagement. They don't feel engaged. So, can you share your perspective on how do we, as leaders, create more inclusive slash diverse, more engaged environments? And so we can draw the best out of our teams.
Yeah, and I like you're saying they don't feel included and they don't feel engaged is because they're not being included. I mean, they
Right.
really just and so the yes, you hire people with diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives, but if we're running meetings in a way that we're not listening to those, well,
Right.
then what's the point there? It's like having the best players and you're not putting them in the game. And so
Right.
a lot of this goes back on really the process of how individuals are running meetings.
Right.
And so I think, and these complex situations, these challenges that are really thorny in the VUCA sort of space, these are wonderful spaces that you want to really leverage the different perspectives of the room. You want to like open up the wisdom of the room. And so how do you do that is you need to first, before you decide what tends to happen, we were talking about the speed, the leader who speaks up too much interrupts. They say
Mhm.
something, and then there's the individual who's quiet, who doesn't say anything, and then there's the individual who can't delegate, who doesn't want to do anything because they have too much on their plate. And
Right.
then the meeting adjourns, and like, okay, good meeting. No, it
Yeah.
wasn't a good meeting because actually nothing happened. And
Right.
so what we need to do is slow down a little bit and up front. And slow down can be 15 minutes, or it can be a retreat. I think it depends on the timing, and really gather a shared reality of shared perspectives of what's going on. And
Right.
so, given this challenge, what do you think? And we have to understand that in some situations, and depending on the kind of the culture of the room, people may not feel safe speaking up. And so, how do you overcome that? And I like this idea of, first of all, you ask individuals to think about it themselves. And so I give 2 to 5 minutes for someone to think about this issue by themselves, all their kind of own bullet points, and then pair them into small groups to discuss together. And then have those groups report out to the larger group, to the larger meeting, the perspectives. And in that way, the one person who may not have said things in front of the whole group can hear that. The small group can hear the perspective and speak out, for the whole group. There's
Right.
processes that we can use to kind of elevate the safety before
Right.
we start to move to options and way forward.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, psychological safety obviously the leadership term, or the professional terms. Like if that doesn't exist, then your clients or your teams are not going to be engaged or felt heard. And so I want to also tie this to some of Keegan's work around growth organization. He uses the term deliberately developmental organization. And I think this is also going to be a real imperative for leaders in this kind of new normal, or as a new normal kind of evolves in the VUCA world that we're in, is that when we look at our teams and we look at our organizations as massive opportunities for growth, right? So the leader does his growth through coaching and leadership development, but what about the team? And it's not like individual team members just getting some coaching. It's like this team comes together and they have these conversations as part and parcel of their daily work, where every day they come, they're excited because there's an opportunity to grow. They will evolve vertically, not just gain some new horizontal skill.
Right.
Is that any a discussion that you're having at Mayo, or what are you guys doing as an organization to become a DDO, or to become a growth organization?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is that how do you scale all of this?
Right.
So it's one
Yeah.
thing to get the executives a coach, but are you going to offer ongoing coaching to everyone at every level? And so, it's a
Yeah.
question there. And so there are
Right.
things that just need to be a part of a common language for how we run meetings, how we interact with each other, how we support each other. And so I think that like building up this coaching skill is a key one. And
Right.
as you build up the coaching skill, that can scale at all levels. And so you can offer programs where people are learning, they're practicing with each other, and these conversations are occurring in that way. I think that's one way.
Right.
I think the other way is just as we're developing leaders, and when I'm talking about developing leaders, I'm talking about leaders at all levels, because
Right. Right.
the leader, and we know, like, there's great research that shows, okay, we're going to do this really thorny thing. Who would you go to in times of trouble? It's oftentimes the the formal leader who people are afraid to go to, and
Right.
oftentimes it's an individual who has no title, who is actually
Right.
the individual is holding people together. That is actually the informal kind of true leader.
Right.
And so we wanted to be developing leaders at all levels. And so how do we develop a common language? And I like things like immunity to change, like helping people understand how to go through um, their own professional goals and the things that have stopped them up. I love frameworks like the Kinevin framework. I love
Mhm.
the grow sort of model. And the more we teach people about that, I think, the better it is. It's difficult, the deliberately developmental organization, because I think we do have to understand that people still, they may not trust the organization as much as the organization wants them to trust.
Right,
And when we have 360s and you're up for the next position, how safe do you feel speaking out your voice?
right.
Is it a culture where you actually should be more quiet, and
Yeah,
and what you say may be used against you? Because there's a
yeah.
lot of dynamics there. I think that can be difficult for the true deliberately developmental
Yeah,
organization.
no, I 100% agree, and, it's kinda like what Dalio in his meritocracy, he said it takes about 18 months for a new staff member to kind of align with that or to really appreciate the power of that. I think it's similar with the DDO. It could take a long time to transform a culture to be a growth inclusive culture, and it take a long time for new people to really orient to that because it's so new. I
Yeah.
think that'll change over time personally, but it's a simple concept, but it's not easy to implement. Let's just put it that way. That's awesome. We got to wrap up here pretty soon, but I do want to ping on one other thing, and I think it's so important. You talk about the importance of leading with story. What do you mean by that, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I think, and particularly for Mayo Clinic, the reason I went to Mayo Clinic is because of the mission and values. I saw an organization that is dedicated on serving the needs of patients. That
Mm,
is that is the primary value. And
right.
so, as we're going through difficult times, and COVID is a difficult time.
Hmm.
Just right now, as we're talking about AI and machine learning and all the changes that we're seeing within the market, all the pressures of all the new medications and the technologies, there are a lot of things that are changing. It's really falling back on the stories of what we have done in the past, how we have overcome, how we
Right.
have lived our mission and values, and embodied them, that really
Hmm.
help us to like kind of level set then how we move forward. The
Right.
difficult thing is though that there are, for us, some of the values, you see innovation, or you see teamwork, or you see integrity, and we can think of, Enron. Integrity was one of their values, and you can
Right.
see how organizations go, well, this is not really so convenient right now to have this value. That starts to really kind of eat the organizations from the inside. And so
Right.
these stories really display what the values are in action, and then help the leaders embody them. And these are things to be doing during times where things are easy, but especially when it's inconvenient, because that's where really the organizations move forward from.
I love that. I think those stories become the guardrails, when things get really chaotic, right? Because it's the story of how the frontline customer service is handling the customer, right? And you could call those rules or processes, but it really is about the why behind it that's important, right? You have to understand that, and that's what you mean by the story,
Totally. Yeah. I mean, telling the story of a patient who's come through the system and
right?
has been helped.
Right.
The individual
Right.
in the community, how it's raised, how what we've been doing has offered opportunities, and raised the health of the community. And I think each of our organizations have these sorts of stories, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a great place to kind of put a pin in this. Thanks so much for your time, Richard. It's been amazing. You're the Leader is your book. You're the Leader Now What? Came out as we record this. You said about a week ago. So congratulations. It's putting a book out is a little bit of a challenge.
It takes a little time. Yeah.
Takes a little bit of time, a little bit of pain involved. So good job.
Yeah.
Um, where do you have a particular website you like people to go to learn more about it, or where can folks kind of reach out or connect with you? And I know you do
Yeah.
speaking and other things. So
Yeah, and so my name, richardwinters.com,
mhm,
is kind of the place, I think, where they can go, and they can look for where to purchase the book and how to contact me.
awesome. Well, Richard, thanks so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. It's brilliant work, and I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot from that. And thanks for what you're doing at Mayo. Mayo's been a real beacon of light in that whole in that medical world, and so I appreciate the work that the Mayo is doing as well. The Mayo Clinic, I should say.
That's right. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Hoo